New York City, November 1935. A crowd is packed shoulder to shoulder around a single car, and nobody in that room can quite explain what they're looking at. No running boards, the metal step that every other car on Earth still has bolted to its side. No headlights either, not until someone reaches in and flips a switch, and two lamps rise up out of the fenders like something out of a movie about the future. It doesn't look like a car built in 1935. It looks like a car that shouldn't exist yet. And, in a back room, away from the crowd, a small group of engineers from the biggest car companies in America are staring at that same machine with a completely different look on their faces. They're not amazed. They're worried. Because they know something the public in that room doesn't know. Whoever built this took a gamble no sane engineer would take, and they're convinced it's going to fail, loudly, in public, very soon. Here's the twist. They were about to be proven almost completely wrong. And yet, this car really was doomed. Just not for a single reason anyone in that back room could have guessed. It wasn't going to be killed by anything under its hood. It was going to be killed by a decision made in a completely different building by the one man who'd made the whole thing possible in the first place. This is the story of the Cord 810 and how a car built to prove the skeptics wrong still didn't survive. To get why this car scared people, you have to picture what a car was in everybody's head in 1935. Every serious car on the road worked the same way. The engine sat up front, and a long metal rod ran underneath the floor all the way to the back wheels to push the car forward. That rod needed a raised hump running down the middle of the cabin to cover it, which is why old cars always feel cramped in the middle seat. That was just how cars were. Nobody questioned it. A designer named Gordon Buehrig questioned it. His idea was almost stupidly simple once you hear it. Instead of pushing the car from the back wheels, why not pull it from the front ones? Do that, and you don't need the long rod anymore. No rod means no hump. No hump means a completely flat floor, and a cabin sitting so low to the ground that this thing looked like it was already moving while parked at the curb. It sounded brilliant on a drawing board. It sounded like a nightmare to the people who actually had to build it in time. Because here's the part almost nobody knew standing in that crowd in New York. This car was rushed. Badly. The company greenlit the whole project so late that engineers had to build the first 100 cars by hand in about 116 days. A tiny fraction of the time a new car normally gets. One prototype was driven clear across the country to get final approval from the boss, and the engineer who drove it came back with exactly 2 notes. The engine ran too hot, and the transmission kept slipping out of gear on its own. Nobody had time left to fix either one. They rolled the show cars out for the cameras anyway. Some of them didn't even have a working transmission installed. Nobody in that crowd could tell. The unveiling worked. It worked better than anyone expected. People started placing orders on the spot, and the company promised the first cars in time for Christmas. That promise alone tells you how far this car had gotten ahead of its own factory because Christmas came and went, and the first real customer didn't get their car until the following April. 4 months late, for a car the whole country had already been told was finished. And once people started actually driving it, the cracks that had been hiding backstage in New York showed up on Main Street. Here's the simplest way to picture the transmission problem. It was originally built to hold 3 gears. Then, late in the process, somebody decided to add a 4th, and instead of redesigning the box to fit it, they just crammed the extra gear into a casing that was never built to hold it. It's the mechanical version of trying to seat 5 people in a 4-seat car. Technically possible. Something has to give. What gave, again and again, was the gear slipping loose at a stoplight, or the engine running so hot on a summer afternoon that the fuel simply stopped flowing and the car died in traffic. Now here's the detail that turns this from a story about a broken car into a story about something much bigger. So hold on to it. Not one of those failures was a flaw in the idea. The flat floor worked. The low, futuristic shape worked so well that car designers were still copying it 30 years later. The only thing that actually failed was time. A brilliant design got sprinted into production on a trade show deadline instead of an engineering one. Remember that contradiction? Because by the end of this video, it's going to matter more than any gearbox ever could. Despite everything working against it, over 1,100 people bought one in that first year anyway, at a price that put it right up against Cadillac. That's not a footnote. That's proof the public wanted exactly what Buick had built, rushed transmission and all. So if the demand was real and the design was years ahead of everyone else on the road, what actually killed this car? This is where the story stops being about engineering completely. And it's worth remembering the promise from the very first 30 seconds. The thing that ended the Cord 810 wasn't a cracked part or a bad weld. It was a signature. The same signature that had made this whole car possible in the first place. Here's what almost nobody watching that unveiling knew. This car didn't exist because one factory decided to build something bold. It existed because a businessman named E.L. Cord had spent the last decade quietly buying up an entire empire. The car company, an aircraft engine maker, an airline, even a taxi cab company, all stacked underneath one holding company with his own name on the door. That empire was the only reason a risky car like this ever got a green light and a budget. Buick had the vision. Cord had the money machine sitting behind him that made the vision possible. And that money machine is exactly what collapsed. As people started digging into how Cord's companies were moving cash and stock between each other, allegations of financial fraud started surfacing. Not about a car that broke down, but about the man whose name was on every company underneath it. This wasn't a scandal about an engine. It was a scandal about the empire itself. And once that story broke, it didn't matter how good the car had gotten. The company paying for it was already being torn apart from the top down. By 1937, less than 2 years after that unveiling in New York, the factory quietly stopped building the Cord 810 altogether. E.L. Cord sold off the pieces of his empire, walked away to Nevada, and went on to make millions somewhere completely different, in real estate. Meanwhile, the car that carried his name, the one that had finally started working the way it was always supposed to, the one the press had finally started respecting, simply had no company left standing behind it. Sit with that for a second. The car didn't get worse. It got better, right as the empire underneath it was getting dismantled by its own founders' mistakes. And here's the proof that this car deserves so much more than it got. 30 years later, in 1966, General Motors needed a halo car to prove Detroit could still out-engineer anyone on Earth. What did they build? The first American front-wheel drive car since this one. Their own designers pointed straight back at the Cord as the reference point. A few years after that, General Motors built a version with hidden headlights and a squared-off hood that deliberately echoed this exact car. An idea that a room full of engineers once decided was too advanced to ever build safely became the industry's own gold standard, the moment somebody finally had enough time to build it properly. So what really happened to the Cord 810 was never actually an engineering story, even though it looks like one from the outside. Every single problem it had, the tight gearbox, the overheating, the rushed testing, traces back to 116 days on a calendar, not to a flaw in Buick's thinking. Give that team even one more year, and this car could have rolled out clean. What it never got the chance to survive was the collapse of the empire that had made it possible in the first place. That room full of engineers said this car shouldn't exist. They were wrong about why it would struggle, and they were wrong about what would finally end it. The Cord 810 didn't fail because it was too far ahead of its time. It failed because the one man who could see that far ahead ran out of company left to build it in.